Picture this. You're a nobleman in 14th century France, and you've just been caught in the most dangerous game imaginable, falling in love with someone you shouldn't. Maybe it's the king's wife. Maybe it's your own sister-in-law, or perhaps you've dared to court a princess promised to another. Your heart pounds as the guards drag you through stone corridors that echo with your footsteps like a death march. You know what awaits you isn't just execution, it's something far more creative, far more personal, designed specifically to punish the crime of forbidden love. This was the reality for countless lovers throughout medieval Europe, where matters of the heart could become matters of life and death in the most brutal ways imaginable. The medieval world had perfected the art of making punishment fit the crime, and when that crime involved royal romance, forbidden passion, or unauthorized desire, the consequences were engineered to destroy not just the body, but the very essence of what it meant to love. Before diving into these forgotten stories of passion and punishment, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the past. The medieval mind operated on a logic that modern sensibilities struggle to comprehend. Love wasn't seen as a beautiful emotion to be celebrated. It was a dangerous force that could topple kingdoms, destroy alliances, and upset the delicate balance of power that kept society functioning. When members of royal courts dared to love outside the boundaries set by politics and protocol, they weren't just breaking hearts, they were committing treason against the natural order itself. This twisted worldview created an entire catalog of punishments specifically designed for crimes of passion. These weren't your typical torture devices. These were instruments crafted with the specific purpose of destroying the physical expressions of love, of making the punishment mirror the crime in the most horrifying ways possible. Let's begin with the lover's embrace, a device so diabolical it seems born from the darkest fairy tale. Picture an iron maiden, but instead of one compartment, it has two, side by side, connected by hinges that allow the entire contraption to close like a deadly book. The interior surfaces are lined with spikes, but here's where the medieval mind's cruelty truly shines. The spikes are positioned precisely to avoid vital organs, ensuring a slow, agonizing death rather than a quick one. When lovers were caught in adultery or forbidden romance, they would be stripped naked and forced into these compartments, face to face, their bodies pressed together in a mockery of their former intimacy. Their device would then slowly close, the spikes piercing their flesh gradually, forcing them to watch each other die while locked in what appeared to be an eternal embrace. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical pain, each lover forced to witness the other's agony, knowing their forbidden passion had brought this fate upon them both. Court records from 12th century Germany describe the use of such a device on Sir Heinrich von Melk and Lady Adelheid, who had dared to conduct an affair while she was promised to a rival duke. The chronicler wrote with disturbing clinical detail about how they were discovered in Heinrich's chambers, how Lady Adelheid's screams echoed through the castle courtyard as they were prepared for their punishment, and how the device took nearly 6 hours to claim their lives while the entire court was forced to watch. But the lover's embrace was just one instrument in a vast arsenal of romantic punishment. The Wheel of Broken Promises represented perhaps the most psychologically devastating approach to punishing forbidden love. This massive wooden wheel, 12 feet in diameter, would be decorated with symbols of the forbidden relationship. Love letters, jewelry exchanged between the lovers, even portraits or personal items that represented their connection. The condemned lover would be bound to the wheel with their arms and legs spread wide, secured at wrists, ankles, and waist. But here's where it becomes truly diabolical. Instead of simply being broken on the wheel like common criminals, romantic offenders faced a more elaborate torture. The wheel would be turned slowly, stopping at each decorated section, while the executioner would use iron rods to break specific bones, one for each token of their love story. A love letter meant a broken finger, a ring meant a shattered wrist, a lock of hair exchanged between lovers meant a crushed foot. The process could take hours, with the victim forced to watch as their romance was literally dismantled piece by piece, their body broken in direct correspondence to the evidence of their forbidden passion. The wheel would continue turning until every symbol of their love had been matched with a broken bone, ensuring that the punishment perfectly mirrored the scope of their romantic crimes. The records of the Papal States contain accounts of this device being used on Brother Marco and Sister Lucia, two monastics who had broken their vows of celibacy. Their correspondence had been discovered by the Mother Superior, revealing months of secret meetings and passionate declarations hidden within religious texts. The wheel used for their punishment was decorated with 43 love letters, 17 pressed flowers they had exchanged, and a wooden cross Brother Marco had carved for Sister Lucia. Each item represented another bone to be broken, another turn of the wheel, another hour of agony that lasted from dawn until sunset. Even more insidious was the Garden of Earthly Delights, named ironically after the famous painting, but representing something far more sinister. This wasn't a single device, but rather an entire chamber designed to punish multiple lovers simultaneously, while forcing them to participate in each other's destruction. Picture a circular room with stone walls, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with iron rings embedded at various heights around the perimeter. Lovers caught in group affairs or complex romantic entanglements would be chained to these rings, but not in the straightforward manner you might expect. Instead, the chains were designed to create a web of connection. Each person's left arm chained to someone else's right leg, their right arm to another person's waist, their legs bound to others in an intricate pattern that forced them into uncomfortable, compromising positions that mocked their former intimacy. But the true horror lay in what came next. In the center of the room stood a brazier, filled with glowing coals, and extending from it were several iron rods with different implements attached, some with branding iron shaped like hearts, others with small knives designed to make precise cuts, still others with caustic substances that would burn flesh on contact. The victims were told that they could end their suffering by using these implements on each other. The psychological torture was devastating. Lovers who had once caressed each other tenderly were forced to choose between their own agony and inflicting pain on their beloved. Some would refuse, enduring hours of increasing discomfort from their restraints and the heat of the brazier. Others would eventually break, reaching for the implements to end their suffering, only to find that using them on their fellow prisoners only intensified the psychological anguish. French court records from the 13th century describe the use of this chamber on 7 members of a complex romantic scandal involving Queen Marguerite's ladies-in-waiting. The affair had involved multiple partners, secret marriages, and even suspected poisoning attempts to eliminate romantic rivals. The Garden of Earthly Delights was prepared specifically for their punishment, with the brazier kept burning for 3 days and nights, while the participants gradually broke down under the combined physical and emotional pressure. Perhaps the most personally devastating device was the Confessional of Venus, designed specifically for cases where romantic crimes involved deception or betrayal within existing marriages. This contraption resembled a church confessional booth, but the similarities ended there. The interior was lined with mirrors, polished metal surfaces that reflected the occupant's image from every angle, ensuring they could never escape seeing themselves. The condemned person would be secured inside while their spouse was forced to operate the device from outside. The booth contained several mechanisms that the betrayed partner could control. Needles that would extend to pierce the adulterer's flesh, heated metal plates that could be pressed against their body, and most cruelly, a system of tubes through which the betrayed spouse could speak directly into the adulterer's ear, describing their pain and humiliation in intimate detail. But the true innovation was the mirror system combined with a series of small viewing ports that allowed the betrayed spouse to watch their unfaithful partner's reaction to every word, every accusation, every expression of hurt and rage. The adulterer was forced to see their own face contort with pain and shame, while simultaneously hearing the devastating emotional impact of their betrayal described in excruciating detail. The device could operate for hours, with the betrayed spouse controlling both the physical torture and the psychological assault. Some would focus on the physical pain, using the needles and heated plates to punish their partner's body. Others concentrated on the emotional torture, spending hours describing how the betrayal had destroyed their trust, their love, their very sense of self. The mirrors ensured that the adulterer couldn't escape their own reactions, couldn't hide from their shame, or pretend the words weren't affecting them. Chronicles from the court of Edward II describe the use of this device on Sir Roger Mortimer, who had been conducting an affair with Queen Isabella while her husband was away on military campaigns. King Edward, upon discovering the affair, spent an entire day operating the confessional of Venus personally, describing in intimate detail how the betrayal had affected not just him personally, but the stability of the entire kingdom. Court observers noted that Sir Roger emerged from the device completely broken psychologically. His hair turned white, and his mind shattered by the combination of physical pain and emotional devastation. The surgeon's table of sorrow represented perhaps the most medically precise approach to punishing romantic crimes. This device was based on the medieval understanding of anatomy and the belief that different parts of the body were responsible for different aspects of love and desire. The table itself was made of stone, with restraints positioned to hold the victim's spread eagle while allowing access to specific parts of their anatomy. What made this device particularly horrifying was its systematic approach to dismantling the physical capacity for love. Medieval physicians believed that the hands were responsible for tender caresses, the lips for passionate kisses, the eyes for longing gazes, and various other body parts for different aspects of romantic connection. The surgeon's table was designed to methodically destroy each of these capabilities. The process would begin with the hands, not simply cutting them off, which would be too quick, but carefully removing individual fingers one at a time, while explaining how each digit had been used to caress forbidden flesh. The lips would be pierced with hot needles, destroying their sensitivity and making future kisses impossible. The eyes might be damaged just enough to impair vision without causing complete blindness, ensuring the victim could see their mutilation, but would struggle to make eye contact with future romantic partners. This wasn't crude butchery, but precise medical torture, carried out by trained physicians who understood exactly how to inflict maximum damage while keeping the victim alive and conscious. The goal wasn't to kill, but to create a living reminder of the consequences of forbidden love. Someone so physically marked that they could never again inspire or experience romantic passion. Italian records from the 14th century detail the use of this table on Lorenzo di Caprese, a young merchant who had seduced the daughter of a powerful duke. The procedure took place over several days, with different aspects of his romantic capabilities destroyed each morning, while he was forced to dictate letters to his former lover, describing his condition and warning her never to see him again. The medieval obsession with poetic justice reached its most twisted expression in devices designed specifically for clergy who broke their vows of celibacy. The chair of broken vows was crafted exclusively for monks, nuns, and priests who dared to pursue earthly love over divine devotion. This wasn't simply a torture chair. It was a theological statement, carved in iron and wood. The chair itself appeared deceptively ornate, resembling the elaborate seats used by high-ranking church officials during important ceremonies. But closer inspection revealed its true nature. The armrests were fitted with mechanisms that would slowly tighten around the victim's wrists, while the seat contained a series of heated metal studs that could be raised or lowered to create varying degrees of discomfort without causing immediate death. What made this device particularly insidious was its integration with religious ritual. The condemned cleric would be dressed in their full ceremonial robes and forced to sit in the chair, while their religious community gathered around them. The torture would be conducted as a perverted form of confession, with the victim required to recite their sins in excruciating detail, while the heated studs slowly burned through their robes and into their flesh. Each confession of romantic desire would trigger another mechanism in the chair. Admitting to holding hands might cause the wrist restraints to tighten. Confessing to stolen kisses would activate heated plates that pressed against their back. Acknowledging more intimate acts would trigger the most painful mechanisms, ensuring that the level of torture matched the perceived severity of their sins against their holy vows. Brother Thomas of Canterbury faced this ordeal in 1298, after being discovered in a passionate relationship with Sister Agnes from a nearby convent. The proceedings lasted from the morning prayers until Vespers, with Brother Thomas forced to confess every detail of their romance while his fellow monks watched his flesh slowly burn. The records note that he was kept alive throughout the entire process, his screams echoing through the monastery as a warning to others who might consider breaking their sacred vows. For royal lovers, however, the ultimate punishment was reserved: the Crown of Thorns Matrimonial. This device represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval irony, a wedding ceremony transformed into an execution method. The condemned lovers would be forced through a complete marriage ritual, but every traditional element was replaced with instruments of torture. The wedding crowns were crafted from iron bands lined with inward-pointing spikes, designed to pierce the scalp gradually as the ceremony progressed. The wedding rings were heated until they glowed red-hot, searing the flesh as they were forced onto unwilling fingers. The marriage bed was constructed with hidden spikes and heated metal plates that would activate once the couple was positioned upon it. The ceremony itself followed traditional wedding protocols with horrifying precision. The lovers would be dressed in elaborate wedding attire, their crowns placed upon their heads as blood began to trickle down their faces. They would be forced to exchange vows while the heated rings burned their fingers, to kiss while their scalps were pierced by the crown spikes, to consummate their union on a bed designed to kill them slowly. The psychological torture was perhaps even worse than the physical pain. These lovers had dreamed of marriage, of a life together, of happiness and intimacy. Instead, they were given a grotesque parody of their deepest desires, forced to experience their wedding day as the moment of their destruction. Every romantic gesture became an instrument of death, every symbol of love transformed into a weapon of punishment. Lady Catherine de Montfort and Sir William of Essex endured this nightmare in 1356 after being caught in a secret marriage that violated Catherine's betrothal to a French duke. The ceremony was conducted in the Great Hall of Montfort Castle, with the entire noble court forced to witness the proceedings. Contemporary accounts describe how Lady Catherine's wedding dress gradually became stained with blood from her crown, how Sir William's hands shook as he placed the burning ring on her finger, and how their final kiss was interrupted by their screams of agony. The Iron Maiden of Memories represented perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated torture device ever created for romantic crimes. Unlike traditional Iron Maidens, this contraption was designed to keep its victim alive indefinitely while systematically destroying their capacity for emotional connection. The interior was lined not with spikes, but with hundreds of small metal points that would press into the victim's flesh without causing fatal wounds. But the true horror lay in the device's integration with the victim's personal history. Before the torture began, interrogators would spend weeks gathering every memento of the forbidden romance. Letters, gifts, locks of hair, pressed flowers, even fragments of clothing worn during romantic encounters. These items would be attached to the interior walls of the maiden, positioned so that the victim would be forced to stare at them throughout their ordeal. As the device slowly closed, the metal points would press into the victim's flesh while they were surrounded by reminders of their lost love. The pressure would increase gradually over days or weeks, creating constant pain without causing death. The victim would be fed through a small opening and kept conscious throughout the process, forced to relive every moment of their romance while experiencing increasing physical agony. The psychological impact was devastating. Happy memories became associated with pain. Romantic thoughts triggered by the mementos became inseparable from physical suffering. Even if the victims somehow survived the ordeal, they would be psychologically incapable of experiencing love again. Every tender emotion would be contaminated by the memory of their torture. Every romantic impulse destroyed by the association with agony. Duke Henry of Normandy commissioned such a device for his wife, Duchess Marie, after discovering her affair with their court musician, Jean de Lys. The Iron Maiden was filled with music sheets Jean had written for Marie, ribbons from her hair that he had kept, and even a small painting he had created of her hands. The Duchess spent 47 days in the device, emerging physically scarred but mentally shattered, never again able to hear music or accept any form of affection without experiencing panic attacks. The pendulum of severed hearts was designed specifically for lovers who had exchanged tokens of affection, rings, lockets, or other physical symbols of their emotional bond. This device consisted of a massive pendulum suspended from the ceiling of a specially constructed chamber. The pendulum itself was a razor-sharp blade, but its path was carefully calculated to create a specific pattern of cuts across the victim's body. The condemned lover would be secured to a table beneath the pendulum, with their romantic tokens arranged around them in a precise pattern. As the pendulum swung back and forth, it would gradually lower with each pass, creating shallow cuts that followed the outline of the arranged mementos. The process was designed to last for hours, with each pass of the blade deeper than the last, slowly carving the evidence of the forbidden romance directly into the victim's flesh. The psychological torture came from the victim's knowledge that each cut represented a cherished memory. A wedding ring might be outlined by a circular cut around their heart. A locket containing a lover's portrait might be traced across their face. Love letters could be arranged to guide cuts across their hands, the same hands that had written passionate declarations of devotion. As the pendulum continued its deadly work, the victim would watch their body being marked with the very symbols that had once brought them joy. The physical pain would intensify with each pass, but the emotional agony of seeing their love story carved into their flesh was often more devastating than the wounds themselves. Sir Edward Plantagenet faced this punishment in 1341 after being discovered with Queen Philippa's cousin, Lady Eleanor. The pendulum chamber was prepared with 17 tokens of their relationship, including a gold ring Edward had commissioned, several letters written in Eleanor's hand, and a silk scarf she had given him before a tournament. The process lasted from sunrise to sunset, with Edward forced to watch as each symbol of their love was traced into his flesh by the descending blade. The Tower of Whispered Confessions represented the most insidious form of psychological torture ever devised for romantic criminals. This wasn't a device that inflicted physical pain, but rather one that destroyed the victim's sanity through the systematic revelation of their most private thoughts and feelings. The tower was a circular chamber with walls designed to amplify and distort sound in specific ways. The victim would be suspended in the center of the chamber by chains that allowed them to move slightly but never escape the acoustic focal point. Hidden throughout the walls were speaking tubes connected to adjacent chambers where interrogators would position themselves with detailed records of the victim's romantic correspondence, private conversations, and intimate confessions gathered through months of surveillance. These interrogators would then begin whispering the victim's most private thoughts back to them, but with subtle distortions that made it impossible to determine if the voices were real or imagined. Love letters would be recited with slight changes that altered their meaning. Private conversations would be repeated with different emotional inflections that made them sound sinister or manipulative. Intimate moments would be described in clinical detail that stripped away all romance and beauty. The victim, suspended in darkness and unable to see their tormentors, would gradually lose their ability to distinguish between reality and fabrication. Their own thoughts would become suspect, their memories contaminated by the whispered distortions. The very foundation of their romantic feelings would be undermined as they began to question whether their love had ever been real or if it had all been manipulation and self-deception. Lady Isabel de Clare endured this torture for 12 days after being accused of conducting an affair with her husband's brother while Lord de Clare was away on crusade. The interrogators had intercepted months of correspondence between the lovers, and had bribed servants to report on their private conversations. The whispered confessions gradually convinced Lady Isabel that her feelings had been artificial, that her lover had been using her for political gain, and that her own emotions were symptoms of moral corruption rather than genuine affection. The cradle of broken promises was perhaps the most psychologically devastating device ever created for punishing mothers who had abandoned their children for forbidden love. This contraption resembled an oversized infant's crib, but its innocent appearance masked a horror designed specifically for women whose romantic desires had led them to neglect their maternal duties. The device was constructed with iron bars that could slowly contract, compressing the victim's body over the course of several days. But the true torture lay in the cradle's contents, actual infants and young children, not the victim's own, but orphans and abandoned babies gathered from across the kingdom. These innocent children would cry and reach through the bars toward the condemned woman, their small hands grasping for the maternal comfort she was forbidden to provide. As the bars slowly compressed around her, the victim would be forced to listen to the children's cries, while being physically unable to comfort them. Her maternal instincts would be weaponized against her, creating an agony that went far beyond physical pain. The device played upon the medieval belief that women who abandoned their children for romantic pursuits had violated the most sacred of natural laws. Lady Margaret of Wessex faced this ordeal in 1367 after abandoning her 3 young children to elope with a traveling minstrel. The cradle was prepared with 7 orphaned infants, their constant crying driving Lady Margaret to a state of psychological collapse long before the physical compression began to threaten her life. Court records note that she begged repeatedly to be allowed to hold the children, offering to confess to any crime if she could simply provide them comfort for a few moments. The loom of unraveled lives was designed specifically for lovers who had woven elaborate deceptions to conceal their affairs. This device consisted of a massive vertical loom, 12 feet tall and 8 feet wide, with the victim secured spread eagle against the frame. But instead of weaving cloth, this loom was designed to unravel human flesh in the most methodical way possible. The process began with thin wire threads attached to various points on the victim's body. Fingernails, hair, small sections of skin that had been carefully lifted with sharp needles. These wires were then connected to the loom's mechanism, which would operate with the same steady rhythm used to create tapestries. But instead of creating something beautiful, each pull of the mechanism would tear away another small piece of the victim's body. The psychological torture came from the device's deliberate pace. Traditional torture methods inflict massive damage quickly, allowing victims to retreat into shock or unconsciousness. The loom of unraveled lives works so slowly that victims remained fully conscious throughout the process, forced to watch as their body was literally unwoven, strand by strand, piece by piece. Brother Francis and Sister Catherine faced this punishment together in 1389 after their elaborate scheme to meet secretly was discovered by their respective religious orders. They had created false identities, forged documents, and even bribed guards to facilitate their meetings over the course of 2 years. The loom was prepared with enough wire to ensure the process would last for days, with each lover forced to watch the other's systematic destruction while experiencing their own gradual unraveling. The Chamber of Echoing Hearts represented the pinnacle of acoustic torture, designed specifically for lovers who had expressed their forbidden passion through music, poetry, or other forms of artistic expression. This circular chamber was constructed with walls, shaped to create specific sound patterns. Whispers would become screams. Gentle songs would transform into cacophonous noise, and loving words would echo back as demonic snarls. The victims would be suspended in the center of the chamber by chains that allowed them to rotate slowly, ensuring they experienced the full range of the room's acoustic horrors. Hidden speakers throughout the walls would play recordings of their own romantic expressions, love songs they had sung together, poetry they had written, even intimate conversations that had been secretly recorded by spies. But these familiar sounds would be distorted by the chamber's acoustics until they became unrecognizable horrors. A tender lullaby would echo back as the screams of the damned. Passionate declarations of love would return as accusations of betrayal and manipulation. The victims' own voices would become weapons used against them, their most beautiful expressions transformed into instruments of torture. Jean de Beaumont, a court musician who had conducted a passionate affair with the Duchess of Burgundy through coded musical compositions, spent 6 days in this chamber, listening to his own compositions transformed into nightmarish cacophonies. The Duchess had commissioned him to write secret musical messages that only she would understand, hidden within official court entertainments. When their code was finally broken, the chamber was prepared with recordings of every piece Jean had composed, each one distorted until it sounded like the music of hell itself. The altar of shattered vows was reserved for the most sacred romantic crimes, lovers who had broken marriage vows or religious commitments to pursue forbidden passion. This device resembled a church altar, complete with religious imagery and sacred symbols, but every element had been corrupted into an instrument of punishment. The altar's surface was lined with heated metal plates, shaped like religious symbols, crosses, angels, sacred hearts, that would burn specific patterns into the victim's flesh. The condemned lover would be secured face down on the altar while a perverted religious ceremony took place around them. Instead of prayers of blessing, the attending clergy would recite detailed accounts of the victim's romantic sins. Instead of holy water, acids would be sprinkled on their exposed flesh. Instead of communion wine, they would be forced to drink bitter compounds that induced nausea and disorientation. The psychological impact was devastating for medieval people, whose entire worldview was shaped by religious faith. To have their romantic feelings branded as demonic, their love characterized as a betrayal of God himself, created a spiritual agony that complemented the physical torture. Many victims emerged from this ordeal convinced that their capacity for love was fundamentally evil, that any future romantic feelings would damn them to eternal punishment. Lady Anne of Gloucester endured this torture in 1394, after being discovered in a passionate relationship with Father Thomas, her family's chaplain. The ceremony lasted for 8 hours, with every romantic gesture they had shared transformed into evidence of their spiritual corruption. The heated crosses burned into her back, created scars that spelled out accusations of heresy and moral degradation in Latin, ensuring she would carry the evidence of her punishment for the remainder of her life. The web of tangled desires was designed for complex romantic situations involving multiple lovers, betrayals, and competing affections. This device consisted of a network of chains, ropes, and wire suspended throughout a large chamber, creating a 3-dimensional maze that victims would be forced to navigate while secured to the web itself. Patingwast and Surshot was. Each victim would be connected to the web at multiple points, wrists, ankles, waist, and neck, but the connections would link them to other victims in ways that made movement impossible without causing pain to their fellow prisoners. If one lover tried to move toward comfort or relief, their movement would tighten restraints on others, forcing them to inflict suffering on people they cared about. In turning nice 20-melt case, 17 screen, the web was designed to recreate the emotional dynamics of complex romantic entanglements in physical form. Jealousy became literal tugs on chains that choked rivals. Desire became desperate reaching that caused pain to loved ones. Betrayal became the choice between personal relief and others' suffering. The victims would be trapped not just physically, but emotionally, forced to experience the psychological dynamics of their romantic crimes as physical realities. The court of King Charles VI of France used this device to punish 7 members of an intricate romantic scandal that had involved secret marriages, broken engagements, forged documents, and suspected poisoning attempts. The web was constructed in the Great Hall of the middle level, Louvre, with each victim connected to represent their relationships in the scandal. The Duchess of Berry, who had been at the center of the affair, found herself positioned so that any attempt to find relief would cause pain to 6 other lovers who had competed for her attention. The mirror of true faces represented perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated torture ever devised for romantic criminals. This device consisted of a chair, positioned before an array of specially crafted mirrors, each one designed to reflect different aspects of the victim's appearance in ways that revealed their inner moral corruption. The mirrors were crafted using techniques known only to the most skilled artisans, combining polished metal with carefully shaped glass to create distortions that seemed to show the viewer's soul rather than their physical form. A mirror might reflect the victim's face, showing the pain they had caused others, their hands revealing the blood of betrayed spouses, their eyes displaying the emptiness that came from selfish desire. The victim would be secured in the chair for days at a time, forced to stare at these reflections, while interrogators described their crimes in intimate detail. The mirrors would show them not as they saw themselves, passionate lovers fighting against unjust restrictions, but as they truly were according to medieval moral understanding. Selfish destroyers whose desires had caused suffering to innocent people. The psychological impact was devastating because the mirrors seemed to reveal truths that the victims had hidden even from themselves. Their romantic self-image would be systematically destroyed as they were forced to see themselves as their victims saw them, as society judged them, as God himself supposedly viewed them. Sir Baldwin de Redvers faced this ordeal in 1358, after conducting simultaneous affairs with 3 married women at the court of Edward III. The mirrors were prepared to show him the faces of the husbands he had betrayed, the children whose homes he had destroyed, and the women whose reputations he had ruined. After 4 days of staring at these reflections, while listening to detailed accounts of the suffering his actions had caused, Sir Baldwin emerged completely broken psychologically, convinced that his very existence was a source of evil in the world. The Garden of Withered Roses was designed specifically for lovers who had expressed their affection through the traditional medieval language of flowers and romantic symbols. This device transformed the courtly tradition of romantic gardens into a landscape of systematic torture, where every beautiful symbol of love became an instrument of pain. The victims would be secured in a garden setting that had been carefully prepared with plants and flowers that matched their romantic history. If they had exchanged roses, the garden would be filled with rose bushes, whose thorns had been sharpened to razor points. If they had shared poems about lilies, those flowers would be present but treated with caustic substances that would burn any skin that touched them. Every romantic symbol from their relationship would be present in the garden, but corrupted into a source of agony. The torture process involved forcing the victims to recreate their romantic rituals in this poisoned paradise. They would be compelled to walk through the garden barefoot, their feet shredded by hidden thorns. They would be forced to smell flowers that released toxic pollen, causing respiratory distress and hallucinations. They would be made to touch plants that had been treated with substances that caused painful burns, transforming every gesture of affection into self-inflicted torture. The psychological impact came from the systematic destruction of romantic symbolism that had once brought joy and meaning to their lives. The garden stripped away the beauty from their love story, revealing it as something that caused only pain and destruction. Even if they survived the ordeal, they would never again be able to see flowers, gardens, or natural beauty without remembering the agony they had experienced. Count Philippe of Anjou and Lady Mathilde faced this torture in 1372, after their affair was discovered through a collection of pressed flowers and romantic poems they had exchanged over several years. The garden was prepared with every species mentioned in their correspondence, but each plant had been carefully treated to become a source of pain rather than beauty. The process lasted for 3 days, with both lovers forced to recreate their courtship rituals while being systematically poisoned and lacerated by the corrupted symbols of their affection. The confession box of whispered sins represented the ultimate fusion of religious and romantic torture, designed specifically for members of the clergy who had broken their vows of celibacy. This device resembled a traditional church confessional booth, but its true purpose was to extract and amplify the victim's most intimate secrets while inflicting psychological torture through the perversion of sacred ritual. The booth was constructed with special acoustic properties that would amplify whispers into screams and transform normal speech into demonic-sounding voices. Hidden within the walls were speaking tubes connected to chambers, where interrogators would position themselves with detailed records of the victim's romantic activities, gathered through months of surveillance and coerced testimony from witnesses. The victim would be secured inside the booth and forced to participate in a perverted confessional ritual. They would be required to confess their romantic sins in excruciating detail, but every admission would be met with accusations that they had not revealed the full truth. The interrogators would use their hidden knowledge to confront the victim with details they had not yet confessed, creating the impression that God himself was revealing their secrets. As the process continued, the acoustic properties of the booth would distort the victim's own voice until they could no longer recognize it as their own. Their confessions would echo back to them as demonic whispers, their prayers would return as blasphemous curses, and their pleas for mercy would be transformed into admissions of guilt. The psychological impact was devastating for individuals whose entire identity was built around their relationship with the divine. Brother Martin of Cluny endured this torture for 7 days after being discovered in a passionate relationship with a young woman who had sought sanctuary at his monastery. The confession box was prepared with detailed records of their meetings, gathered through testimony from other monks who had been secretly observing his behavior for months. The process gradually convinced Brother Martin that his romantic feelings were literally demonic possessions, that his capacity for human love was evidence of his spiritual corruption. These devices represent only a fraction of the medieval arsenal designed specifically for punishing crimes of passion. Each one was crafted not just to inflict pain, but to destroy the very capacity for romantic feeling that had led to the forbidden relationships in the first place. The medieval mind, obsessed with moral order and social stability, had created an entire science of torture, designed to ensure that love itself became a source of terror for those who dared to feel it outside the boundaries of law and custom. The victims of these devices were not just individuals who had made poor romantic choices. They were human beings whose only crime was feeling emotions that their society had declared forbidden. Their suffering serves as a reminder of how quickly love can become dangerous when it threatens the power structures that societies use to maintain control over their citizens. Looking back across the centuries at these instruments of romantic punishment, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The medieval obsession with controlling love didn't disappear with the end of the Middle Ages. It simply evolved, became more subtle, found new ways to express itself through different institutions and social structures. The devices we've explored weren't just medieval curiosities. They were the physical manifestation of a worldview that saw individual desire as fundamentally dangerous to social order. This same impulse to control and punish unauthorized love continues today, though the methods have become more sophisticated and the torture more psychological than physical. Consider how honor killings still occur in various parts of the world, where families murder their own daughters for choosing unauthorized romantic partners. Think about conversion therapy practices that attempt to torture people out of their natural sexual orientations. Look at forced marriages that trap individuals in relationships they never chose while criminalizing the love they actually feel. The iron maidens and torture wheels have been replaced by legal systems that don't recognize certain forms of love, by social ostracism that destroys lives just as effectively as medieval devices destroyed bodies, by economic pressures that force people to choose between love and survival. Even in societies that pride themselves on romantic freedom, we see echoes of medieval thinking. Workplace policies that forbid relationships between colleagues, immigration laws that separate lovers based on nationality, age of consent laws that criminalize teenage romance. All of these represent modern attempts to control who can love whom and under what circumstances. The medieval torture masters understood something that modern societies still grapple with. Love is perhaps the most powerful force for disrupting established order. When people choose love over duty, passion over profit, individual happiness over social stability, they threaten the very foundations upon which power structures are built. The lover's embrace, the wheel of broken promises, the garden of withered roses, these weren't just instruments of physical torture. They were warnings, demonstrations of what happens when individual desire challenges collective authority. They were designed to make the punishment so horrific, so memorable, that the mere possibility of such consequences would deter others from following their hearts. But here's what the medieval torture masters never understood, and what modern authorities still struggle to accept. Love cannot be tortured out of existence. Every device they created, every punishment they inflicted, every warning they issued only served to demonstrate the incredible power of human affection to survive even the most extreme attempts at suppression. The lovers who endured these torments often faced their punishment with a courage that amazed even their executioners. They died holding hands when possible, whispering words of affection through their pain, maintaining their emotional connection even as their bodies were systematically destroyed. Their love stories became legends, passed down through generations of people who understood that some things are worth suffering for. Lady Catherine and Sir William, locked in their deadly wedding embrace, reportedly spent their final moments composing a poem together, each contributing lines, while the heated irons slowly claimed their lives. Brother Thomas and Sister Agnes, facing the chair of broken vows, used their forced confessions to create a coded declaration of love that inspired secret romances throughout their monastery for decades afterward. These victims transformed their torture into testimony, their punishment into poetry, their destruction into declarations of love's ultimate victory over authority. They proved that while societies can control bodies, they cannot control hearts. While laws can regulate behavior, they cannot regulate emotion. While torture can destroy flesh, it cannot destroy the human capacity to love. The medieval period ended not because its torture devices became less effective, but because societies gradually learned that attempting to control love through violence creates more problems than it solves. The energy spent on romantic surveillance and punishment could be better used for productive purposes. The social disruption caused by public tortures often exceeded the disruption caused by the original romantic crimes. More importantly, people began to understand that love, even unauthorized love, wasn't necessarily a threat to social order. Passionate relationships could coexist with stable societies. Individual happiness could complement collective welfare. The choice between duty and desire didn't always have to end in tragedy. But this evolution took centuries, and it's still incomplete. We live in a world where the medieval impulse to control romantic choice continues to manifest in new forms. The torture devices may be gone, but the underlying belief that society has the right to determine who can love whom persists in countless ways. The stories we've explored tonight should serve as more than just historical curiosities or entertainment. They should remind us that the capacity for both love and cruelty exists in every human society, including our own. They should make us question our own assumptions about which forms of love deserve protection and which deserve punishment. Most importantly, they should inspire us to defend the right of individuals to make their own romantic choices, even when those choices challenge conventional wisdom or threaten established power structures. The medieval lovers who faced torture and death for following their hearts were fighting the same battle that continues today, the struggle between individual freedom and collective control, between personal happiness and social conformity. Their suffering wasn't meaningless if it helps us recognize that love, in all its forms, deserves protection rather than punishment. Their courage wasn't wasted if it inspires us to resist the modern equivalents of medieval romance control. Their stories weren't forgotten if they remind us that the heart's desire for connection and affection is one of the most fundamental human drives, one that no amount of torture, legal prohibition, or social pressure can ultimately destroy. The medieval torture masters believed they were protecting their societies from the chaos of uncontrolled passion. Instead, they created a different kind of chaos, the chaos that comes from systematically denying basic human nature. They thought they were preserving order by punishing love. Instead, they discovered that love, even when tortured, has a way of inspiring others to rebel against the systems that would destroy it. Tonight, as we remember these forgotten victims of romantic persecution, we honor not just their suffering, but their triumph. They prove that love, however forbidden, however punished, however tortured, remains one of the most powerful forces in human experience. Their pain purchased lessons that we're still learning. Their courage lit candles that still burn in the darkness of oppression. The torture devices have been melted down. The execution chambers have crumbled. The medieval courts that ordered these punishments have fallen to dust. But love endures. It survives every attempt to control it, outlasts every effort to destroy it, transcends every boundary that societies try to impose upon it. In the end, that may be the most fitting punishment for the creators of these romantic torture devices. Not that they faced justice for their cruelty, but that their victims achieved exactly what the torturers sought to prevent. They loved completely, passionately, and eternally. They transformed their final moments into eternal testimonies to love's power over fear, connection's triumph over isolation, and the human heart's victory over every attempt to cage it. As we reach the end of our journey through these corridors of romantic horror, we must ask ourselves a fundamental question. What drove an entire civilization to create such elaborate instruments of torture specifically for crimes of the heart? The answer lies not in medieval sadism, but in something far more disturbing: a systematic understanding of human psychology that remains chillingly relevant today. The medieval authorities who commissioned these devices weren't simply cruel, they were strategic. They understood that the most effective way to control a population wasn't through random violence, but through targeted punishment that would reshape how people thought about love itself. Every spike, every heated plate, every carefully calculated mechanism was designed not just to kill, but to send a message that would echo through generations. These torture masters had discovered something that modern behavioral scientists are only beginning to understand. Trauma can be inherited. The children who witnessed their parents' romantic executions, the servants who cleaned blood from the torture chambers, the nobles who attended these gruesome spectacles, they all carried the psychological scars forward into their own relationships. Love became associated with danger, passion with punishment, desire with death. This generational trauma created exactly what the authorities wanted: a population that policed its own romantic impulses. People didn't need constant surveillance when they carried the torture chamber within their own minds. The threat of punishment became so internalized that most individuals never dared to pursue forbidden love in the first place. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of these devices was how they transformed love from a private emotion into a public spectacle. Medieval romance became a performance art where every gesture was scrutinized, every glance analyzed, every expression of affection weighed against political necessity. The torture chambers serve as constant reminders that even the most intimate human connections were subject to state approval. The witnesses to these romantic executions returned to their daily lives forever changed. They had seen what happened when individual desire challenged collective authority. They had watched as the most fundamental human drive, the need for connection and affection, was systematically destroyed by the very societies that claimed to protect human welfare. Yet, in documenting these horrors, we must also acknowledge an uncomfortable truth about ourselves. We consume these stories with a mixture of revulsion and fascination that mirrors the medieval crowds who gathered to watch romantic torture. We tell ourselves we're learning from history, but part of us is drawn to the same dark spectacle that entertained our ancestors. This attraction to romantic suffering hasn't disappeared, it's simply migrated to different venues. We create entertainment that celebrates the destruction of relationships. We follow celebrity breakups with voyeuristic intensity. We turn personal romantic failures into public content for social media consumption. The torture chambers have become digital platforms. The executioners have become anonymous commenters. But the underlying impulse, to witness and participate in romantic destruction remains remarkably consistent. The medieval period teaches us that societies always find ways to justify the control of individual love, whether through religious doctrine, political necessity, social stability, or cultural preservation. Authorities create elaborate rationales for determining who can love whom under what circumstances. The torture devices were simply the most extreme expression of this universal human tendency to regulate the hearts of others. Today, as we face our own romantic restrictions and social pressures, we would do well to remember these medieval lovers who paid the ultimate price for following their hearts. Their courage in the face of unimaginable punishment reminds us that love, however forbidden, however dangerous, however costly, remains worth defending. The torture chambers are empty now, their mechanisms rusted, their purposes forgotten by most of the world. But the human capacity for both love and cruelty that created them continues to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. Understanding this history isn't just about honoring the dead. It's about recognizing the living forces that still seek to control, punish, and destroy unauthorized love in our own time. As you leave this exploration of medieval romantic punishment, carry with you not just the horror of what humans can do to each other, but also the inspiration of what they're willing to endure for love. In a world that still seeks to regulate the heart, their courage remains our greatest weapon against those who would cage human affection. The devices may be gone, but the choice they represented remains. Will we be the torturers or the lovers? Will we seek to control others' hearts or defend their right to feel? Will we inherit the cruelty of the past or the courage of those who died for love? The answer lies not in history books, but in how we treat the forbidden love stories unfolding around us every day. The medieval torture chambers teach us that love, however punished, always finds a way to survive. The question is whether we'll help it flourish or join the long line of those who sought to destroy it. These forgotten lovers died so that we might remember. Love, in all its forms, deserves protection rather than punishment. Their screams have faded, but their message echoes still through the centuries. That no torture device, however clever, can ultimately defeat the human heart's determination to love freely.